Hello, and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice for environment, social, and governance leaders. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds. Today, we're excited to bring to you the second episode in our ongoing series about the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Report Directive. Now, that's a mouthful. It's otherwise known as CSRD. The new requirements go into effect for companies worldwide, and we want to really help you and companies like you get ready for them. My colleague Andy Wood kicked off in June with a chat episode details and how the impact of CSRD was going to happen along with the timeline for compliance. The reporting requirements are extensive. In another recent episode, Allison Anderson Book, Chief Sustainability Officer at Baker Hughes, told us her team, get this, 1,100 metrics that they believe they will be responsible for under CSRD. Let me repeat that for you. 1,100 metrics that they believe they will be responsible for under CSRD. Almost 4 times more than what their company reported on its latest sustainability report. In this episode, we are grateful to be joined by 2 of the members of our own ESG Advisory Council. They represent stakeholders in our external group that advises us on our ESG strategy, our product, and our go-to-market approach. They are with us today to help unpack how we should be preparing for CSRD and other regulations. We have Amelia Pan, Managing Director in ESG Transition for PJT Partners, a global advisory-focused investment bank, and Diana Teed, previously of MSCI in the C-suite, where she was the global head of index, as well as the company's first Chief Responsibility Officer. As many of you know them or have heard of them before with your connection with Workiva, if you're new to the show, welcome Diana and Amelia, and we look forward to hearing what they have to share with us today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks, Mandi. Great to be here.
So Amelia, let's start things off with you. You've had extensive experience advising global corporations on the impact of ESG. And what have you been hearing from companies as they are wrestling and getting ready for CSRD? Do you think that these challenges are going to surface with this new requirement?
Well, Mandi, you're exactly right. I mean, I think we've all, every year it seems like in ESG world, there's a big topic. And the topic this year is CSRD. I sit in London, but I'm obviously American, and I work with companies on both sides of the Atlantic. And it might be a European reporting requirement, but American companies are also keeping an eye on what's happening over here. And in terms of challenges, I mean, I think Allison's exactly right. I don't know if every company is reporting against 1,000 metrics. I think one of the challenges is that what the requirements will entail seem to constantly be changing. So at one point, it was going to require 80 different types of mandatory metrics. Now the CSRD is thinking, well, actually, maybe companies are only going to be required to report against things that are material to their business. Now, that's very welcome for businesses, obviously, for obvious reasons. They can really focus on materiality. They can take the results of the materiality assessment and really, spread that and take that even further. Another challenge, when you have all of these reporting requirements, is how you're going to resource that. And so the companies that I talk to are really thinking about who are they going to put? Is there, on this? Is there going to be a separate reporting team? How does that reporting line look, and what are the various stages that they need to implement? Where are the milestones to get ready for CSRD? So one of the companies I talked to has 8 different steps in place before they even get to reporting CSRD.
As we think about that, I think you're exactly right. It's welcome for companies to have it based on industry level, based on material issues. Workiva had recently conducted a survey. It was over 500 financial leaders across Europe to understand as they were gearing up? What were some of their mindsets and what were they thinking? And many teams reported, and it was 37% of respondents felt overwhelmed during the previous reporting period. And now there's these additional requirements such as Scope 3 reporting. How can companies really tackle this new workload as you're working with them and thinking about it, Amelia?
Well, I think the good news for companies is that because this is an ongoing, incoming, pending regulation, they don't need to convince their management teams that this is important and it needs attention and resources, right? And sometimes in sustainability, we struggle to get both of those from our management teams. They know this is coming. They know that there's going to be a time limit and it's a regulation, so it's going to happen. I think the other thing, too, is in the absence of something concrete at the moment, just to really keep an eye on what the direction of travel is. And really the direction of travel is the focus on materiality, the focus on your business. And I think if companies really, keep a laser eye on that, then no matter how much it changes or, what gets added to it, at the very least, they can focus on communicating the key material issues, which is what investors are really focused on. And it seems like that's what the regulations now are looking toward as well.
Diana, I want to take a moment and turn the table over to you. The CSRD spans across E, S, and G. So why is it important for companies to look at ESG with a broader lens and not just focus on climate? And you've had that experience as a chief responsibility officer.
Absolutely. I think if we take a step back and think about the CSRD, when it was drafted, it really has an eye towards driving capital towards sustainable activities and companies. And to facilitate that, also making data available that's reliable and consistent. And when we think about sustainable companies and when those drafting think about them, it's not just climate, right? Environmental, social, governance, all actually related to each other, because can you have best climate practices without governance of them, for example? But really the thought is that if we look across these areas and integrate them with the firm's entire strategy, where all of these areas are very important, then companies are able to focus on those areas that drive the highest value for them. So it's not one of these areas like climate that's the most important. The companies need to look across all, but also across their firm-wide strategies and integrate the review together to identify those highest value driving areas and then report on them with reliable data to investors so that capital flows into sustainable operations that helps the world prepare for the transformations that are coming. And you really see this in the desire for investors to invest in sustainable companies. Several reports are showing about a 12% CAGR on the growth of sustainable investing. And some show that it could be up to 22% of global investable assets are in sustainable funds in the next few years. So that drive for seeing a comprehensive view of companies and identifying sustainable companies, so investors and portfolio managers can future-proof their portfolios against these coming transformations, really making sure that the companies are looking across all that they do to identify risk and opportunities as the world transforms.
I'm curious because you touch a little bit about it being cross-functional and cross-functional teams addressing some of these issues. Did you see that in your experience at MSCI? And is that a way they should be thinking about addressing what they're moving towards with integrated reporting?
Yes, absolutely. Really integrated reporting, the mix of financial and non-financial disclosures all into one report. And in order to do that and have an integrated view, we see companies creating ESG committees and teams who are all involved in the processes. So whether it's internal audit, the controller group, the human resources, product teams, research teams across the whole organization, corporate sustainability teams, of course, and corporate secretaries, right, actively involved because they're producing the firm's financial statements and engaging on that side. You really see this activity go across the firm. And I think you're also, firms across the globe are, I think, starting to make this move of bringing the groups together, but also starting to think about the truly integrated reporting and bringing the information into how do you operationally bring it into a single report.
We all had the opportunity to be together in London for Workiva's Accelerate, which was a roadshow and experience with different customers and prospects and talking through with leaders around what are they thinking about as it relates to CSRD and this collide of finance and sustainability. And what stood out to me in our conversation was the discussion around it being bifurcated between what is needed for reporting requirements versus what's really the top responsibility of a chief sustainability officer. And I wanted us to unpack that for our audience because it was a really interesting conversation we were having as we were all together. Amelia, what's your perspective there between reporting versus the responsibility of the chief sustainability officer?
Yeah, I mean, I think as these regulations come into fore, as the reporting standards start to coalesce around maybe the International Sustainability Standards Board, what's become very clear is that ESG, which has always been an investor concern, is now really focusing on the data even more than it was before. And the data itself is maturing, right? So we are now able to collect emissions data to a reasonable degree of granularity. There are DEI data, stats on worker safety now that companies are starting to collect and report against, and they might now have a track record or a history that they're starting to build. So I think what we're starting to find is that moving from a position in the early days where investors would say, the self-reported data from the companies is really just garbage in, garbage out. I can't really do anything with this. I can't model this. It's not decision useful. We're now moving to a place where these entire teams that we talked about earlier are responsible for collecting decision useful data. They're responsible for validating it and for making sure that ultimately at some point it might be audited, right? And that will also protect the company from claims of greenwashing. It will make them a more attractive investment for investors. So that's one role, and that's a full-time job. Now, the other role is that of a chief sustainability officer, and sometimes the data reporting absolutely is a piece of that. Other times, that role is very high level, potentially C-suite. We've talked about, I've had conversations with people about how the chief sustainability officer is the new C-suite role, because really it is a management level role. You sit above all the different business lines. In order to collect the data, in order to really understand what it means, you need to be working across the entire business, just as Diana was talking about, and really building alliances, really, making sure that people understand why this is important, why it's urgent. And it's a strategic role because you often report into the CEO or the CFO, you give board updates. And so, often we see that combined into one role, but increasingly, even if it falls under the CSO's responsibilities, there will be somebody in charge of managing a team that collects the data.
Diana, I love how Amelia built on that. And she talked a little bit about the audit and the assurance process. And it was interesting to think through this piece. We did a third-party verification to assess the process with interviews for more than 52 decision makers. There was a study done by Verdantix. And we learned from that 1/5 of them, and the audience sees me reading, I wanted to get this right, 1/5 of them did not define a strategy to achieve ESG assurance. And I wondered, building on Amelia's comment, what does that mean as somebody who is the head of Global Index and how you think about that from investor grade confidence?
Yeah, I think if we take an example like climate, right, and we step back again and say, okay, what are we all thinking about here? And there are numbers out there saying it will take $3 to $5 trillion a year to fund the climate transition. The governments don't have all that money around the world, so they need to look to the private sector, right? And then the private sector needs to look to companies and investors. And the investors who we're looking to fund this transition partially, right, are used to having top quality, reliable data from which they can make investment decisions. So companies, as part of this effort and the corporate sustainability efforts, are getting their heads around and really starting to absorb that the idea that there are big differences between the quality of their financial data and their corporate sustainability data, is that really viable? And the answer is the CSRD and stakeholders globally are saying, no, we need to see top quality, reliable data that can be relied on to make these investment decisions from companies coming out of, their corporate sustainability initiatives and integrated with their financial disclosures. So companies, I think, are starting to look at that. We've seen companies, talking to a few companies lately, starting to bring data to disclosure committees, whether it's an ESG disclosure committee. I would say about half the ones I speak to have a separate committee, but others are starting to familiarize their company-wide disclosure committee with more of their ESG disclosures. So while there's a long way to go for several firms globally, I think firms are starting to think about how this all can come together into more systematic data that they're producing that they feel confident in, and the investors and analysts who are looking at it, just like they look at financial information, will then be able to have reliable, trustworthy, comparable information and even historical time series of information in the corporate sustainability area.
I think you're exactly right. And a pro tip for individuals listening, I think that's why you were just recently with us in Chicago at our customer advisory board meeting for ESG. And we see some who have moved from the SEC role and over to overseeing, or SEC, if you're from a smaller mid-sized company or regional bank, right? Colliding the reporting role with the financial role. That's a piece that we've started to see. If you have a larger disclosure committee, a pro tip from Workiva, our own practice is we have the vice president of financial reporting, who is the chair of that work stream and is also a member of our executive task force, because they're feeding that collaborative collide that Amelia talked about. So it could be in the committee structure where it's integrated and you've got the right person looking at it. And it could also be within the role structure to think about for those listening on. We'll slowly work through this internal audit. Well, once we looked at rating agencies and investors wanting the trusted data, they increased the weighting that they gave to assurance this year. And so for us, that actually sped us up a little bit faster on our journey because of that reason, knowing that even though regulation was coming and we were on that journey, it was actually the investors that drove us a little bit faster than even the regulatory space. As we think about the end of May, we've got the UK Financial Reporting Council announcing plans, overhauling corporate governance code for the first time in 5 years. It was intended to think about how we think about this governance and audit side. And Amelia, I've heard that this proposal is kind of compared to SOX, or known as Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US. As you're in London, what are you hearing? What are some of your thoughts there of that coming across the Atlantic?
Well, it's super interesting that this happened. And it happened because of a few high-profile company failures, which were not caused by, but which the auditors didn't catch, right? So there were a number of FTSE PLC companies that basically went out of business. And so it really caused the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, to really think about how are they going to prevent this from happening? And initially, they were thinking about creating this framework for internal controls. What they ended up doing, as you just said, is overhauling the responsibility for board directors under the corporate governance code. And what it does specifically is it imposes additional responsibilities on boards and audit committees relating to five key areas, many of which you can consider sustainability areas. So sustainability, disclosure of material failures or weaknesses, and compensation clawbacks are some of them, right? So what I find interesting about this is that it puts the responsibility squarely on boards. And in conversations with boards over the years, when I talk about ESG, responses range from, well, that's very interesting, but isn't it just a load of nonsense? To people who are super on board and are thinking about how to implement it. And what the UK has done is said these are all now part of the board's responsibility. So what I think that will do is it'll really encourage boards to think about ESG issues more. I mean, we've always said that ESG issues are fiduciary issues for boards, and I think this just really crystallizes it.
Well, I think that even goes back to, we opened and talked about with Allison in Baker Hughes in her interview. And it was about this idea that as companies move forward, They really have to think about the material issues in a trusted space and sharing warts and all, really sharing, this is what we got right and this is what we got wrong. Even with our own team, we're getting ready to release our full ESG impact report. And I was like, you can't just talk about everything that went right. And we have to talk about conditions, right? The conditions that we discuss on a regular basis as an executive task force. We are dependent on different things happening in this transition. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we're actually not telling the full story like we need to. And so I think we're going to see more and more companies, especially out of this. It's not only about the numbers, but it's about the governance, the strategy, the pros and the cons, and then how that transparency flows. Well, I know that we all are also very, what I like to say, the balance between challenge and support. I see us as three dynamic women that love to find that balance between challenge and supporting people to success in all of our careers. And we would be remiss to only talk about challenges. So I would love to hear the silver lining. I would love to hear what you all think is really going to come forward as the opportunity in CSRD and bring organizations along. Diana, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch, right? So one we talked about a bit, but it's kind of triggering companies who are already disclosing information to really think about getting that to the quality level it should be for public disclosure. So kind of getting them focused. So even though it's a European regulation, it impacts global companies globally. And so even speaking to a company last week where they have a US-based large multinational company where they have a 3-year strategy in place now today for CSRD readiness, right? And so for all of us, I think that's a bit of a call to action. They realize and think that it's going to take them 3 years to get ready, to get all of the data gathered and to the quality level they need to, and to do those materiality assessments and identify those key areas. So probably time to start looking at this, and that's one great aspect of it. Another aspect is it drives the integration of thinking and that mind transformation of saying, corporate sustainability and ESG probably really shouldn't sit in a separate silo in a company's thinking. If these changes are coming and we're looking at what makes a sustainable company and environment, social, governance issues and more, then really integrating them into the firm-wide strategy and identifying the highest value areas is better for all of us, investors as well as the companies. And then the third, to wrap it up, I would say, is with all of this additional data and historical data, time series, but investment decision, quality data, there's really an opportunity for companies to say, we are really busy. So circling back to your comments at the beginning, Mandy, some small teams managing a whole load of information. How do we deal with those challenges in everyday business? And we look towards automation. So can companies start, and we do see them starting to say, I need to institutionalize this data collection and management process, bring in one single tool and advance the technology side so that they have a single platform like Workiva, but as one example, but really a single platform with financial and non-financial data that really allows them, instead of spending time in spreadsheets and collecting emails, as all of us have done, is really spending the time driving the value in those initiatives that will really make a difference for the success of the company in the future.
I don't think I could say it any better than Diana. I thought that was amazing. I guess the only thing I would say is the silver lining is, we're moving very quickly from a situation of mass confusion, alphabet soup, despair, to a very streamlined, rigorous, disciplined process where, one day soon we'll have an agreed set of standards, we'll have metrics that are decision useful, we'll have regulations, that span various jurisdictions. And what that will do is it'll help bring transparency to the markets and to company reporting of non-financial and financial disclosures. It'll credentialize sustainability initiatives as valuation relevant, decision useful information. And I think that is a massive silver lining, as painful as it feels right now.
I really value and appreciate the time that we get to spend together. You get to hold up a topic and we get to look at it from all different angles. And I always walk away learning one more thing and thinking deeper for our own team. I hope that encourages everyone out there as you think about, is there value to an external stakeholder group or an external ESG advisor? You kind of got to see today what some of that value is. You get to take what's relevant to your business and then really think about how you can share it with not only your company internally, but external with all the stakeholders and that listen as a part of the ESG Talk audience. So thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Mandy. It was so much fun.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to please check out Workiva's CSRD content, including our CSRD readiness webinar series. We also have more episodes coming for you to explore CSRD with some special guests. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk real soon.